The King of Fire and Water. James still looked pale and distressed even when the doctor was safely arrived and examining Mrs. Stanton in the living room. He drew aside his nearest brothers, who happened to be Paul and Will, and moved them out of earshot of the rest. He said unhappily, "Mary's disappeared." "Disappeared?" "Honestly, I told her not to go. I didn't think she would. I thought she'd be too scared." Worry had sent stoical James close to tears. "Go where?" said Paul sharply. "Out to the manor. It was after Max went to get you. Gwenny and Bar were in the living room with Mum. Mum and I were in the kitchen making some tea, and she got all upset and said Max had been gone far too long, and we ought to go check whether anything had happened to him. I told her not to be daft. Of course we shouldn't go, but just then Gwen called me up to go and make up a fire in there, and when I called back, Mary was gone, and so were her coat and boots." He sniffed. "I couldn't see any sign of where she'd gone outside. The rain had started, and there weren't any footprints. I was just going to go out after her without saying anything, because the girls had enough to worry about, but then you came, and I thought she'd be with you, only she wasn't. Oh, dear," said James woefully. "She is a silly ass." "Never mind," Paul said. "She can't have gone far. Just go and wait for a good moment to explain to Dad and tell him I've gone to pick her up. I'll take Will. We're both dressed for it." "Good," said Will, who had hastily been trying to think of arguments for his going. When they were out in the rain again, the snow already beginning to squelch gray-white underneath, Paul said, "Don't you think it's time you told me what this is about?" "What?" said Will, astonished. "What are you mixed up in?" Paul said, his pale blue eyes peering severely through the heavy spectacles. "Nothing. Look, if Mary's going off might have something to do with it, you absolutely got to explain." "Oh, dear," Will said. He looked at Paul's threatening determination and wondered how you explained to an elder brother that an 11-year-old was no longer quite an 11-year-old, but a creature subtly different from the human race, fighting for its survival. "Of course you didn't," he said. "It's these, I think." Glancing cautiously about him, he tugged his jacket and sweater clear of his belt and showed Paul the signs. "They're antiques, just buckle things that Mr. Dawson gave me for my birthday. But they must be really valuable, because 2 or 3 weird people keep turning up, trying to get hold of them. One man chased me in Huntercombe Lane once, and that old tramp was mixed up with them somehow. That was why I didn't want to bring him home the day we found him in the snow." He thought how very improbable it sounded. Paul said. "And that fellow at the manor, the new butler, Lion, isn't it? Is he mixed up with these clowns?" "Oh, no," Will said hastily. "He's a friend of mine." Paul looked at him for a moment, expressionless. Will thought of his patient understanding that night in the attic at the beginning, and of the way he played the old flute, and knew that if there were any one of his brothers that he could confide in, it would be Paul. But that was out of the question. Paul said, "Obviously you haven't told me the half of it, but that'll have to do. I take it you think those antique chasers might have nobbled Mary with some sort of hostage." They had reached the end of the driveway. The rain beat down on them, hard yet not vicious. It ran down the snow banks, poured from the trees, turned the road into the beginning of a rapidly moving stream. They looked up and down in vain. Will said, "They must have. I mean, she'd have gone straight toward the manor, so why didn't we see her on our way home?" "We'll go that way anyway to check." Paul tilted his head suddenly and glared at the sky. "This rain, it's ridiculous. Just suddenly. Out of all the snow. And it's so much warmer, too. Makes no sense." He splashed off up the running stream that was Huntercombe Lane and glanced at Will with a baffled half-grin. "But a lot of things aren't making much sense to me at the moment." "Ah," Will said, no." He splashed away noisily to cover his remorse and peered through the sheets of rain for some sign of his sister. The noise round them was astonishing now, an ocean of noise, spattering, foam and washing shingle and breaking waves, as the wind brought the rain sluicing rhythmically through the trees. A most ancient noise, as if they stood on the edge of some great ocean, before men or their ancestors were even born. Up the road they went, peering doggedly, calling, anxious now. Everything they saw became strange all over again, as the rain carved the snow into new lanes and hillocks. But when they came to one corner, Will knew suddenly very well where they were. He saw Paul duck defensively behind one raised arm. He heard the harsh, raucous croaking, abruptly loud and then gone. Saw, even through the flying rain, the flurry of black feathers as the gaggle of rooks swooped low past their heads. Paul straightened up, staring. "What on earth?" "Get to the other side of the road," Will said, pushing him firmly sideways. "The rooks go sort of crazy sometimes. I've seen it before." Another shrieking swoop of birds came at Paul from behind, driving him forward, while the first dived again to force Will against the snowbank, along the edge of the drift-buried wood. Again they came, and again Will wondered, dodging, whether his brother had realized that they were being herded like sheep, driven where the rooks wanted them to go. But even as he wondered, he knew he was too late. The gray sheet of rain had separated them entirely. He had no idea where Paul had gone. He yelled in panic, "Paul? Paul?" But as the old one in him took control, calming the fear, he cut off the shout. This was not a matter for ordinary human beings, even of his own family. He should be glad to be alone. He knew now that Mary must be caught somewhere, held by the dark. Only he had any chance of getting her back. He stood in the driving rain, staring about him. The light was dying rapidly. Will unbuckled his belt and strapped it round his right wrist. Then he said a word in the old speech and held up his arm, and from the signs a steady pathway of light beamed out as if from a torch. It shone on ruffled brown water, where the road was becoming a river, deeper and flowing fast. He remembered that Merriman had said long before that the most dangerous peak of the Dark's power would come at 12th night. Was that time now come? He had lost his place in the days. They ran into one another in his mind. Water washed at the edge of his boot. As he stood wondering, he jumped hastily backward to the snowbank edging the wood, and a brown wave in the road river took a large bite out of the snow wall on which he had been standing. In the light from the signs, Will saw that now other chunks of dirty snow and ice bobbed in that water. As it flowed past, it was gradually undercutting the hard-packed banks left on either side by the snowplow, and carrying away broken pieces like miniature icebergs. Other things were there in the water, too. He saw a bucket bob past him, and a tufted object that looked like a sack of hay. The water must be rising high enough to carry things away from people's gardens, perhaps his own among them. How could it rise so fast? As if in answer, the rain hammered at his back, and more snow broke beneath his foot, and he remembered that the ground underneath him must still be frozen bone-hard by the great cold that had paralyzed the land before the rain came. Nowhere would this rain be able to soak into the soil. The thawing of the land would take far longer than the melting of the snow, and in the meantime the snow water had nowhere to go, no alternative but to run over the surface of the frozen countryside looking for a river to join. The floods will be dreadful, Will thought. Worse than they've ever been before. Worse even than the cold. But a voice broke in him, a shout through the rushing water and roaring rain. He stumbled up over the slush-edged mounds of snow to peer through the murk. The shadow came again. "Will, over here!" "Paul?" Will called hopefully, but he knew it was not Paul's voice. "Here! Over here!" The shout came from the river road itself, out in the dark. Will held up the signs. Their light beamed out over the churning water and showed him what he took at first for clouds of steam. Then he saw that the curling steam was the puffing of breath, great deep breaths from a gigantic horse standing foursquare in the water, small wild waves foaming past its knees. Will saw the broad back, the long chestnut mane plastered wet on the neck, and he knew that this was either Castor or Pollux, one of the great two Shire horses from Dawson's farm. The light from the signs flicked higher. He saw old George, muffled in black oilskins, perched high on the back of the massive horse. "Over here, Will. Through the water before it rises too fast. We have work to do. Come on." He had never heard old George sound demanding before. This was the old one, not the amiable farmhand, leaning against the horse's neck. The old man urged it closer through the water. "Come on, Polly. Come by, Sir Pollux." And the big Pollux snorted puffs of steam through his broad nostrils and took a few solid paces forward, so that Will was able to stumble out of the river road and grasp at his tree-like leg. The water came almost to his thighs, but he was so wet from the rain already that it made little difference. There was no saddle on the great horse, only a sodden blanket, but with astonishing strength old George leaned down and heaved at his hand, and with much struggling he was up. The light from the signs strapped to his wrist did not waver through all the turning and twisting, but remained directed firmly forward. at the way they should go. Will slipped and slithered on the broad bank, too wide for his straddling. George tugged him to sit in front, astride the great curving neck. "Polly's shoulders have taken greater weight than you," he shouted in Will's ear. They were swaying forward as the stolid cart horse lurched off again, splashing through the growing steam, away from the Rook's wood, away from the Stanton's house. "Where are we going?" Will yelled, staring fearfully out at the darkness. He could see nothing anywhere, only the swirling water and the light of the signs. "We go to raise the hunt," the cracked old voice said close to his ear. "The hunt? What hunt, George? I must find Mary. They've got Mary somewhere, and I lost sight of Paul." "We go to raise the hunt," the voice at his back said steadily. "I have seen Paul. He is safe on his way home by now. Mary you will find in due course. It is time for the hunter. Will, the white horse must come to the hunter, and you must take her there. This is the ordering of things you have forgotten. The river is coming to the valley, and the white horse must come to the hunter, and then we shall see what we shall see. We have work to do, Will." And the rain beat down on them harder, and somewhere distant thunder rumbled in the early night, as the huge Shire horse Pollock splashed patiently on through the rising brown river that had once been Huntercombe Lane. It was impossible to tell where they were. The wind was rising, and Will could hear the sounds of swaying trees above the steady churning of Pollux' feet. Scarcely a light showed in the village. He supposed that the electric power must still be cut off, either by accident or by agent of the dark. In any case, most of the people of this part of the village were still at the manor. "Where's Merriman?" he called through the loud rain. "At the manor," George shouted in his ear, "with Farmer. Beset." "You mean they're trapped?" Will's voice turned shrill with alarm. Old George said, hissing close, hard to hear, "They hold attention, so we may work, and the floods make them busy too. Look down, boy." In the churning water, the light from the signs showed a scatter of unlikely objects bobbing past. A wicker basket, several disintegrating cardboard boxes, a bright red candle, some tangled strands of ribbon. Suddenly Will recognized one piece of ribbon, a lurid purple and yellow check, as a wrapping he had seen Mary carefully pull off a parcel and roll up on Christmas Day. She was a great hoarder, like a squirrel. This had gone into her hoard. "Those things are from our house, George." "Flood's there, then," the old man said. "Land's low. No danger, though. Be easy. Just water and mud." Will knew he was right, but again he longed to see for himself. Rushing about they would all be, moving furniture and rugs, clearing books and everything movable. These first floating objects must have escaped before anyone noticed the water was actually carrying things off.